What is up, everybody? Sven Diesel here. We're going to be tying up a WereWolf Minnow. This is using a material that's called WereWolf Hair. It's a product developed by Frankenfly. I picked it up through J Stockart. So let's go ahead and get started. This is a Arex TP610 and a 2/0. Let's make sure it's in the vise because this is a really sharp hook, and the last thing I want is it slipping and going into my fingers. So we're going to start here with some Semperfli Nano Silk. This is a 3/0 200 denier in black, and we're just going to go ahead and start this right here behind the eye, and I'll advance all the way down with, you don't need touching wraps, but just advance it down to the bend of the hook, and I'll go ahead and trim out this tag end. I don't do the touching wraps because I like the spiral. I think it gives a little bit more grip as I'm securing a lot of materials. So for this, we're using some WereWolf hair. This is the colors black and red. We're going to be using primarily black for this and just some accent, like a little bit of a red head. And what I'm going to do is less is more. I'm just going to pull out about I don't even know how big a clump this is. It's a pretty small clump right here, and I really love the length of this, but we're going to be folding it in half. So I found the halfway point, and I'm just going to be tying it in with about 4 to 5 wraps as I progress up the shank of the hook, keeping this other material in the forward position, and then once I get that 5 wraps, I'll fold it back over itself. And what we just did is we created a slight taper with this material that's going to be the core of our tail. And so since we found the middle, those hairs we just folded back over are going to be slightly shorter. And so I'll advance up a little bit more, and there we have the core of our tail. Now for the next little part here, I'm going to do that one more time because I want it to be a really narrow, dense tail. So I'll go ahead and grab out a little bit bigger clump, but not by much. I don't know how many fibers this is, probably. It looks like 15, 20 fibers. It's about half of what I think I should use. And I'll do the same, just making sure that I don't have like an extra long. If you have some fibers that are really, really long, just kind of pull them out and restack them in this group. And I'm just going to find the halfway point, and we'll go ahead and secure that right there. And you can see we're about a 1/4 of an inch further up this time. And so these hairs are a little bit shorter than what we just folded back over. And we'll go ahead and do the same thing and fold this over again. So we've now created 2 segments now that are tapered, and the bulk of our tail sitting on the top of the shank of the hook. So we're not going to worry about those fouling, and we are good to go. Now I'm going to tie in the next section in 2 parts to show how you would do a 2-part color scheme, but for this we're going to be doing just one color for the main body. And so I'm going to align the hairs up, and we're going to basically do the same process, except for I'm not going to tie it quite in the halfway point. I'm going to tie it in about I think this is the 5/8 to 3/8. So that way we're adding a little bit more profile, and I'm going to tie it in on the top of the shank of the hook. I'll test to see how I like it, and that looks good in length. And then we'll turn over our vise, and I'll tie in on the underside. And for this, we're going to if you're doing a second color, for example, like you want a white belly on on a minnow, this is where you would add the darker shade on top and the lighter shade right now as the belly. But for this, we're doing just solid black, and so I'm going to do the same process. Just line this up so that that's pretty much matching what I did on top. And then we will advance our thread as we fold the one section over. I'll advance my thread up and over, and then holding it so that I didn't trap any fibers, I'll go ahead and pull back that top section and just kind of wiggle that around with your thumb so that those fibers are all the way around the shank of the hook. We want them primarily on the top and the bottom, but you still want the sides covered. And now we'll build up a little bit of a thread dam, and the way I do that is simply advancing the thread forward and then focusing my wraps right up against those hairs. And now we'll brush it out just to make sure we like how this profile is going, get out any knots or clumps or any hairs that for some reason might not be secure. And I'm just dividing this down so we're parting it around the point of the hook just to see how I like that. And that is going to give me profile and have a really, really nice taper to it. So we'll advance up. The remainder of our fly or hook shank here, we're going to divide with 3 more tie-in points. So just kind of use that as you're measuring. And since we're using black for the entire body of this, except for the head, I'm just going to do a quick way of doing this. And I'm not going to tie in a top portion and a bottom portion, but rather I'm going to take these fibers and just basically, I think these are a little bit long, so I'm going to actually trim them in half. I don't want these going all the way into the tail. I want the bulk of it, the body, to be around the hook. And so I'll just cut that in half and kind of re-taper it so that we're not having the butt ends all focused in one area. So we now have the butt ends are in the middle of this bulk, and I'll go ahead and tie that in the middle of this, which is now cut in half, so it's a little bit shorter. And then I'll spiral all these hair fibers and flash all the way around the shank of the hook, just wiggling it with my thumb and finger, and letting the bobbin hold that thread tension. I'll do another wrap just to make sure it's tight, and then I'll kind of just separate that the best I can. And then I'll work my thread through that, trying not to trap fibers, and then go ahead and pull all these back. Now, I trapped a little bit of fibers, I'm thinking, right there, but we'll go ahead and build up a thread dam and brush it out and see how it looks. Luckily, this isn't our most forward section, so it's not as critical, but it's good to practice these techniques all the way up. So let's see how that looks. I'll go ahead and brush it out. It's looking pretty decent. I know you can't really see the profile taper at this point, but it has one for sure. These fibers, since we cut them in half, the bulk of them are going about to the back, a little bit past the bend of the hook, and then the longer fibers are tapering into the tail. So this is actually, that turned out really nice. So depending on how long you do it, you need to adjust your fiber length. So for this next section, I will do the same process. I'll just take a bigger clump and I will tie it in right here. We went up to the two of the remaining three tie-ins, and I'll take a little bit of the similar clump, I'll cut it in half, restack those fibers, and so that we're not having butt ends all going one way. I don't think the fish will care too much, but I know it will affect your taper slightly. And so we'll go ahead and tie this in, and then we will wrap that with our fingers, just kind of rotating all those fibers around, kind of forcing them up and over around the shank, and then we'll part it and see how it looks. And these are going to be tapering right into where I want them, so this is almost perfect. So we'll go ahead and just build up another thread dam here as I pinch those, making sure that I don't wrap my thread up and over the material. We don't want to lose those fibers exiting the hook shank at a perpendicular angle, slightly backwards. We're just kind of forcing them to go slightly backwards. So this is looking really, really nice. I really love this black color. It's got the perfect amount of flash in here. It almost looks like a peacock flash. And we all know peacock is a very, very fishy color. So you can see the bulk right there is at the shank of the hook. I probably shouldn't have used a black background for this. The white would have shown you this better. But as that tapers and gets wet, it's just going to flow right into a point. So let's get out the red. I'm going to pull out probably a similar clump to what we just did. And then we'll go ahead and fold this in half, and I'll go ahead and cut it. And you could tie this in without cutting it and then trim the head. I know a lot of guys that do that, but I'm not wanting to waste much material, and so I'm going to fold it in half again. So roughly all these fibers are now a fourth of the total length of these WereWolf Hair fibers, and so we're just going to stack that and make sure we got a nice taper. If I have some that are really, really long, just pull them out, or you could trim them later. But I'll go ahead and tie this in roughly at, it's not quite the half. You can't see it, but I have a little bit more coming off the front than I do the back. And I'll go ahead and twist that all the way around. And you can still, it's a little bit loose, so I'll just pull that out so I have a little bit more coming off the front, and then I'll separate those, dividing them as equally as I can. If anything, you want a little bit more on top than on bottom. And I'll go ahead and build up this little thread dam right here, trapping those fibers back. If you have a little bit of a clump like I have right there, just twist them around with your finger. We want pretty much the focus of these fibers being on the top and the bottom, not so much as the sides, but you do want even coverage. But the other thing is we're going to be covering this with some eyes, so no one will ever see it. So you'll still get all the likes you want on social media. They won't see that I didn't have that completely covered, but you can see now that I've forced those fibers around, that's a really good head right there. I really like how that turned out. So we're pretty much done with the body of the fly. I'm just going to add some accent hackle fibers to add a little bit more depth of the grizzly barring, and we're using the American hackle, and I believe this is red grizzly. I can't remember if there's a particular color to this. I actually threw away the package, And so I'm just going to select some nice and thin feathers from the side that have a little bit of length. We need it to be roughly about 5 inches. I don't want it going all the way to the longest point, but I want it going about 2/3 to 3/4 of the way down this fly. And I'll just have it go right on the top, and we'll tie that in. I'll fold it back over itself, and I'll just go ahead and trim that out. And we're going to be gluing this in at a later point with the eyes, and so you don't need to get it super solid on your thread wraps because the glue will get in there, but I don't want it shifting. I want it staying on top. Another material, if you wanted at this point, you could add in like a lateral line of flash, but we're not going to be doing it on this one. I want to keep it primarily dark with that highlight of the red head. And so we'll go ahead and do this on the other side at this point, just matching the length to make sure that it's a perfect match. And I'll have it kind of not, these aren't on the top of the shank, but it's on the sides of the top of the shank. And I'll just go ahead and I'll tie that in the similar method. I'll check the length. That looks pretty good. And to help with that profile, you can see how they're kind of curving up. I'm not tying them straight back. I'm tying them so that they go up, and then as it gets wet, it's going to follow that profile we created and just lead into a nice taper. So let's go ahead and clean up that head, and we'll go ahead and do another little trick here. I'm going to add some fibers, a little bit bigger of a feather that has a little bit more web from the back of this saddle. And I don't need the whole feather because we don't have too much room, for one, and two, I really just want the webbiness, the webby feathers, so that they flow and pulsate as you strip this in the still water. So we'll go ahead and tie that off. I'll trim that out, and you can save that for another fly to add as like we did with the previous feathers. And then we'll go ahead and palmer this, almost like you're making one of those deer heads for the muskies. We're not going to trim this up. I'm actually going to be trying to mimic our top and bottom profile, but just palmer that around, focusing on getting all those feathers back. We will be tying a little bit more of the head, so that will force this feather to kind of cone backwards. And like I said, I've said this probably 6 times already, we're focusing most of the bulk of this on the top and the bottom to create that narrow profile. And so we're going to wrap this all the way up into that eye. And if we crowd the eye, that's okay, because we're going to be using our thread to kind of push all this back. But you can see we have, this just adds really good segmentation at the front. There's a little bit of sheen to this feather, which might help. But here we go. Let's go ahead and just wrap back over what we've done. And this eye is allowing the thread to not slip over the eye. So that's an important thing, is that you're using a hook that has a large eye. It also makes it easy to tie on when you're freezing this fall, fishing streamers in cold temperatures and you're shaking to tie it off. So we're just going to do a 3-turn whip finish, and I'll go ahead and cut out the stem. I didn't cut out the stem before because I've had it before where I pull the stem to cut it and it slips my thread off and I lose everything. So you can see right there, really narrow profile. In width, we got the tall height. So next step is, let's go ahead and get our eyes on here. Now, I'm not the best at this, I'll be the first to admit, but there are a few tricks I've learned, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to use UV resin because I don't want to wait for this to dry. I want it to be done and fishable right now. So I just have a thick resin I'm applying right here to this side, and I found that this thick resin really has a good tackiness for the eyes. And I ran a little bit over the top, and we're selecting these eyes I picked up from Spawn Fly Fish. It's I don't have the sizing, but it's a really good eye for this pattern. It gives it a real spooky look to match the WereWolf Hair. And I'll just go ahead and place that lightly in position, trying not to glob the resin anywhere that it doesn't want to go. Like, I don't want it going into the hackle fibers at this point, like past the eye. And so I'll just kind of position those first with the distance from the hook eye, and then secondly, I'll make sure that they're at the same place in relation to the hook eye in terms of height of the profile. If anything, you want most of it above the hook point, but that's looking pretty good. And then as I squeeze them in, I'll go ahead and cure it with the UV light now, so that they're cured into position. These are not solid at this point. We didn't use a glue that's really adhering. I've had eyes that will fall off at this point, and so that's why I just stuck with this thick resin. I've had good luck with it, and then this is where we're really going to seal the deal. I'm filling this gap, making sure that some of this resin touches those side eyes, and then I will add that in between the eyes to just build up a nice resin head, and I'm kind of filling that crack, and then it looks pretty good as is, and then I'll go ahead and cure that, and then I'll do the underside once I have it where I like it. So you can see I didn't fill it all the way to the circumference of the eye. I left a little bit more because I'm going to be using a different resin for that. And so we'll go ahead and do that to the underside now, focusing on that crack first, and then kind of bringing it now up and around the hook eye so it bonds to that top section that we did. And so there we go. I got kind of a stray there, and I'll form it to where I want it and go ahead and cure that. That's looking pretty good. So this thick resin has a little bit of flexible properties to it. It also does not have a no tack finish. So now I'm using some Semperfli no tack UV. It's a little bit of a harder resin, but it really bonds well, and will form the outside coat of this. And I'm kind of working that around the eye, covering the entire eye, filling all the gaps, using the tip to kind of spread it around. And then as I notice a low area or an area that needs more, I just give it a slight squeeze. Like I'm barely oozing this out, maybe 10 to 15 drops. Maybe that sounds like more than what I made it out to be, but basically just cover that whole eye, work it around, filling all the cracks, being sure not to get it in that hook eye, and then I'll just check it to see how it looks, and we're looking pretty good. It's nice and even. It's kind of soaking in, and so I'm looking for any spots where it kind of maybe adhered or seeped into a crack or into the feathers a little bit more so. Over here I got a little bit more I could add, and that's looking really good. So let's go ahead and just spin this around, making sure the resin is how you like it, and then we'll go ahead and start curing it as I continually rotate it, because I found sometimes if I just hold it stationary, sometimes the resin on the other side might seep down, and then I'm left with a clump or a glob, and I don't like it. And but I don't think the fish care. But there we go. That is a WereWolf Minnow. If you have any fibers that bother you, just go ahead and trim them out. I'm just going to cure this a little bit extra because of the amount of resin we put on there. Should be ultra durable. Pretty simple fly. This WereWolf Hair sheds the water. Comes in a bunch of different colors. You can pick up that American hackle in a bunch of different colors, and these eyes come in a bunch of different colors. So pretty simple. Catches fish. Fish it on a sink tip or sinking line, and hope they pierce some lips for you. Thanks for watching, and happy tying.